Welcome, everyone. We are continuing our series. This is the Colloquium series conducted by the Great Books Honors College and the Christian Institute for the Study of Liberal Arts. And this event today is going to focus on conversational learning. We're going to be talking about two readings, one from Plato's Republic and another from Mortimer Adler's book, How to Speak, How to Listen. So we have some material we actually will be focusing on in our discussion. And so what I'd like to do is go ahead and just turn it over to our other folks here, starting with Bryant, and let them introduce themselves, who they are, and their standing in the program, and what we're going to be doing today. Bryant?
Thank you, Dr. Woods. My name is Bryant Owens. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the Great Books Honors College. At this point, I am in my third semester. At the end of this semester, I believe, have 4 classes complete, and focusing in the areas of philosophy and religion.
Okay, very good. My name is Dr. Chad Redwing. I'm a fellow at the Great Books Honors with the Great Books Honors Program, and I will also be your discussion moderator today.
I'm Dr. David Stark. I'm the Research and Writing Fellow for Information Technology at the Institute.
I'm David Withen. I am a graduate student, a master's degree student at the Great Books Honors College. I'm also a middle school and elementary school history teacher at a classical charter school.
My name is Jeff Cray. I am in the PhD program at the Great Books Honors College and have, after this semester, Lord willing, just one more semester until my dissertation project. And so we'll see what happens with that.
All right, Dr. Redwing, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you and let you get us started here.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I was thinking that we probably should begin with the Adler work. Then we'll look at Plato's Republic, and then hopefully have some synthetic comparisons and contrasts towards the end of the discussion. So I thought we would try maybe 30 to 45 minutes interpretively with each text, and then begin comparison or synthetic conversation at the end. To do that, I have an introductory question that I thought might at least get the conversation started. And that question is the following. Why does Adler suggest, and this is a quote from page 1, why does Adler suggest, quote, the seminar kind of teaching and learning makes the most fruitful contribution to the continued growth of the mature mind?
I guess we didn't lay down any rules, protocol for speaking. We could do it like class, or since there's smaller numbers, maybe people can chime in, and if we talk over each other a little bit, that'll happen. But either way works for me.
Perfect.
What paragraph is that question in?
I'm looking. I have my notes on a separate page, and so here we go. It is 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs down. I'm sorry, 5 paragraphs down. It's the last one. So the entire paragraph reads as follows. Their absence leaves a large and deplorable gap in the development of the growing mind. From long experience with it, I also know that the seminar kind of teaching and learning makes the most fruitful contribution to the continued growth of the mature mind. I was just wondering what people's thoughts were on, first of all, what that means. There's a lot of components to that sentence about what fruitful contribution might mean in that sentence, what continued growth is, and of course, that giant question of what is a mature mind. So I will read body language first. Please begin when you have an idea. Also, I know it takes a minute, so if there's a little silence, that's just fine too.
Well, I don't mind getting us started on this one. I did notice later Adler talks about the mature mind again at the very end, and I actually noted it there, but I did not note it early on. And there at the end, in near the end, I don't see it right now what page, but he mentions, actually it's on page 5. He says, in the former case, the seminar serves the purpose of continued learning by mature persons long after they have left school. I wonder if part of it isn't that maybe developmentally early on we learn well by having things kind of put into our mind, if you would, but as time goes on, we need the interaction to be able to agree or disagree or think through what actually is being asserted instead of just data being communicated, but thinking through it is what he may be talking about, why it's most fruitful.
Excellent. Very good. Other comments?
Dr. Redwing, if I could add a thought. When I think of something mature, I think of something that has been cultivated. I think of something that has taken a lot of effort to grow. And I see in what Adler is writing here, it's as if he is laying the groundwork here for, definitely not for children. He's definitely talking about responsible adults, if I should, more so than children, because with children you have to teach them a little bit differently. You do have to have a little bit more firm guidelines for a younger person. But as someone grows older, there is an expectation of responsibility. There's an expectation of being able to take care of things without being told, and that's a sign of maturity. And what I see here in what he's writing is, it's almost like laying out a step-by-step, here's how you cultivate a garden of the mind. Here's how you cultivate something that grows to maturity that's ripe. And you don't pick it until it's ready. If you pick it too soon, it's too green, it's not tasty, it has no nutritional value. But once you grow older, there is a point where the plant is supposed to produce. But there's a lot of work that goes into that. You've got to cultivate it, you've got to guide it, you've got to prune it, shape it, allow it to flourish. But then once it reaches maturity, you just stand back and watch the fruit come.
Okay, excellent. So I think these two comments have set our goalpost. I think we're getting into the discussion. I don't know why I asked that question until about right now, with you fleshing it out. And I think it's this, that we want to know, when Adler talks about Socratic teaching, we want to know how to do it. And so maybe that's the second set of questions we'll look in a little bit. But he's also pondering when we do it. And so maybe this is a better way of asking that first question. When do we do this? When do we do Socratic teaching? And I noted the tension that both of you suggested, because on page 2, he says that sometimes young participants are even better in some ways. That's paragraph 2, the fourth line in paragraph 2.
So, Dr. Wedring, are you suggesting here that perhaps we take for granted that someone is not mature enough for a Socratic teaching method? Do we want to wait later and we should start earlier?
I don't know. I mean, and on one hand, he says mature mind, and then on the other hand, he says it should be done much younger. So I think it's a quandary, right? This is an interpretive worry in this text. So now if everyone could begin to chime in and flesh out this concept of when we do this, and then we'll focus on the how, which is a whole nother set of questions. What are other people's thoughts on when we do this Socratic kind of learning? Yes.
I'm sorry. I can say that I teach children in the school that I work at. I teach children as young as even 5 and 6 years old sometimes, My normal students are 5th and 6th graders, so between 9 and 12 years old, and I found that this kind of teaching, this seminar approach, it does work very well, even with their age. I mean, at least once a week in my class, I do something very similar to what we do at the Great Books Honors College. Just this week, we read the first chapter of Genesis in our Introduction to Ancient Judaism, and we talked about it in much the same way that we do here. And I was very impressed with the ability of their minds to really get into the meaning of that text. And I found that at the end of the week, when I hand out the quiz on Friday, that very often the things that stuck out the most to them and that they remember are those things those conclusions that we reach together in talking about the text, and not necessarily things that I simply dictated to them in a lecture at a different point in the week.
Okay, interesting. You used the term like state of mind of these of students, and it brings me to page 4, just so I can add another textual place where he talks about this, so people can begin to comment further. First full paragraph on page 4, Adler says, a third prerequisite is the state of mind that the participants bring to the seminar. So now we say it's for the mature mind, then he says the young, and Mr. Withen is kind of reinforcing that with his own teaching observations, but now he's saying it's a mature mind, and the young sometimes do it better, but that it really hinges on a state of mind. What does this mean?
Later on, and I think this is one of the real blessings and impacts of this method of learning. Later on in that same paragraph, he talks about docility, and that calls to mind the need for humility in learning, and how children especially, I'll just go ahead and say humans who are unspoiled by pride, but children especially are able to approach the learning in a humble attitude. So that I think is one of the key things. And the Socratic process, because you're always going to be challenged, or you are going to be challenged at some point by some responsive question, it kind of encourages and pushes people into humility in a way that other types of learning don't. And so I think the humility aspect is part of that state of mind. It may not be everything, but it's at least part of that state of mind.
That's very interesting. He doesn't use the word humility. He uses the word open. Is that the same thing for you? Do you think he's saying the same thing you are?
In a sense, I think he is, in being open to the fact that maybe what I think I know, I don't know, or being open to new information and weighing that, and not just rejecting it because it differs from what I've already learned. And that, to me, is a type of humility. But I think there is a corollary. It may not be one-to-one.
But it does seem like the same kind of state of mind, though. Very good. Other comments before I push and poke and prod a little bit at our comments?
I would like to confirm what was just said. I think now I'm rethinking the whole definition of mature.
Yeah.
And maybe the mature person, who could be a child, is that virtue of docility, that is teachability. That now it may be for different reasons. So now as I speak it, I am correcting my own thinking on this, but that one sign of maturity would be this teachability, this openness to being taught. And children do seem to be open to this, but maybe not for maturity's sake. So it's just a thought there.
That's a giant push in one direction. What do people think of this? Dr. Woods is suggesting that the mature mind has nothing to do with age and everything to do with this state of mind, which may occur when young and may occur when not so young. And then we've got to talk more about what this docility is that you've brought up as well. So, yes, I see now body language. I think I'm finally getting you warmed up and ready to go on a Sunday afternoon. So, Mr. Owens.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Redwing.
You're welcome.
I think the definition of mature mind could also imply expectation. And so if we expect a youthful child, say 5 or 6 years old or even 8 years old, to be a child, they're going to think like a child, they're going to act like a child, and they will have no responsibility. But if we begin to cultivate a mature mind in the education process, part of education is not just a bunch of regurgitation of facts and soaking in data. It is also a process of pruning. It's a process of experimentation. It's a process of interaction. It's teaching by example. It's from an early stage, if we set the expectation of the mind, then as the body ages and as the child comes into maturity, then that mind will already be primed and probably shaped before they reach maturity.
Okay, interesting. I believe I saw Mr. Withen with a corporal sign that he's ready to speak. Am I correct? No. Okay.
I might just throw in another question here by way of kind of pushing this line a bit further. And I wonder if it might help us to kind of clarify by contrast in terms of what the other two main educational approaches are that Adler cites and what their, I don't know, distinctive modes or chief avenues of payoff are.
Excellent. That's a wonderful direction, because this will take us not only into when we do it, but when we do the other kinds of learning as well. Which, excellent. Dr. Stark, would you like to point us in the text where Mortimer Adler brings up these three kinds of teaching as a way to get us all on the same page?
Oh, sure. I think probably page 1, paragraph 3 is probably the most direct and concise discussion of that.
Excellent. Do you mind reading it for us, just so we all?
Yeah, where he says the three kinds of teaching, didactic, Socratic, and coaching, are correlated with three kinds of learning. The acquisition of organized knowledge in basic fields of subject matter is the kind of learning that is aided by didactic teaching, teaching by telling, lectures, and textbooks, the development of all the intellectual skills in the kind of learning that requires coaching. The third form of teaching, the Socratic method of teaching by asking and by discussion, facilitates the kind of learning that is an enlargement of the understanding of basic ideas and values.
Interesting. So is Adler saying there that another hallmark of this mature mind that we're trying to understand, which is probably both open and humble, which is docile, if we've brought that in, it also is a mind that is capable of understanding basic ideas and values? And if so, what does that mean? What are these basic ideals and values that he speaks of? This is tough. And if we can't get at it that way, let's talk about the other ones first. So if we don't yet, or if we're not ready to grapple with what understanding of basic ideas and values are, could we talk a little bit about what didactic and coaching approaches are?
I had a discussion this past week with someone, and we were talking about another Adler piece, and the comment was made that, well, Adler seems to think that teaching and or learning occurs this way, and it does not occur that way and that way. And it dawned on me, rereading this for today, that Adler does not believe that. Adler actually considers all of these ways of teaching and learning. And so where I've come to the point to where I don't see nearly as much value in lecturing and lectures as I did 10, 15 years ago. There is still a value. In other words, something happens in a good lecture. Something, information and part of the persona of the lecturer is communicated, and students take that in. And so teaching is happening, but it does seem, I mean, I'm pretty sure that for Adler, this is the kind of the pinnacle, as in there's something that happens in a conversation that does not happen in these other modes, as Dr. Stark said.
Excellent. And so really, we've now expanded our initial question from when do we teach Socratically to now when do we teach didactically, when do we teach Socratically, and when do we coach? If what you're suggesting is true, and it seems to be, that he values all three of these, we don't need to know just when to teach Socratically, but when to teach in the other two modes as well. So you've just tripled our homework now. This is this is great. So ideas on where he leads us in terms. Let's just start with if it sounds you're using language like pinnacle, as if we're striving upwards and outwards towards something. So let's start at the base. When do we teach didactically, according to Adler?
I don't know that it's in this work, but in another Adler piece that he mentions here, the Paideia proposal, he lays out these three types of teaching. He seems to lay them out in a way that suggests age, or what we would think as grade level. But I think it can be expanded to familiarity with any given subject, where in the beginning, where there's the most amount of ignorance, there should be the most amount of didactic instruction. And then as that information starts to be acquired and assimilated to some extent, you move on into the coaching, which is to help further that understanding, and then into the Socratic, so that progressing from, say, kindergarten through 12th grade, early on there will be a large amount of didactic, a smaller amount of coaching, and a much, much smaller amount of Socratic, but then that's going to shift, and the didactic is going to become much smaller, and the Socratic much larger as a proficiency develops towards the upper grades. I think that could be applied to any subject coming to it from ignorance. Didactic is first and foremost of importance, and then coaching to make sure there is some understanding taking place, and then the Socratic to really develop a mastery would be the third.
Excellent, thank you. It seems like we're still at this tension then, right? Because in your comments you're suggesting that actually it does have something to do with age. That younger we do didactic. Is this what you're saying?
Well, yes and no. In the Paideia proposal, because he's dealing with formal categories of knowledge that people are acquiring, it does lay itself out to be used as a reform to the U.S. education system in an age-based way. But I think it applies to any concept, whether you're 4 years old or 40 or 80. If it's something brand new, that the didactic is helpful in the beginning, but then you need someone to coach, and then you need a community to interact with for that Socratic understanding and the real mastery.
That's interesting. I'm glad I pushed a little bit. So you're saying it's it's our familiarity with the concept that defines our age on a particular topic.
Maybe there is a maturity in specific concepts that could be measured somehow.
That is interesting. Dr. Stark.
Yeah, I was just kind of to bridge off of what Mr. Cray was saying. The structure that Adler has in that paragraph that third paragraph on page 1 is pretty latently based on the trivium itself. Mm-hmm. So at the didactic level, we're learning the grammar of a particular subject. Then we move on to dialectic and then into rhetoric. So if you are 4 or 40 and are new to a particular subject, you need to learn first the grammar of that subject in order to be able to then progress into dialectic and rhetoric about it. Like Mr. Withen was saying earlier, I forget what grade level you're talking about, but elementary schoolers, by the end of a week's discussion of Genesis, were able to have a fruitful rhetorical experience vis-a-vis Genesis 1, because they had first kind of progressed through some of that other material. So those were kind of the thoughts that I had.
Excellent. If it's okay with everyone, I'm going to put some fuel on our Socratic fire here. I don't understand why then, if you're saying, and you're right, Dr. Stark, he says this, that it's organized knowledge first for didactic, then these intellectual skills are coached, and finally we understand ideas and values through Socratic. Why would we not want to do the exact opposite when we teach? I always have small age children, including my own, who always want to know why we're doing something before we do it. Why does Adler take the other approach and says, no, you must have organized knowledge and skills before you talk about understanding? Or is he even saying that? So that's my fuel for the day.
I wonder if it's something like, I had a professor once who was talking about the idea of shared ignorance or pooling our ignorance. And if we do not have something substantive to talk about, then there is a kind of, just going on, and people may not really be talking about something real other than, rambling ideas in their own mind. And then you certainly will not have much of much communication or conversation going on there, I don't think, of a real nature.
So you're suggesting we'd be talking about shadows. How interesting for this.
Yes, right. There we go. Yeah, we're looking at shadows and we're talking about, as opposed to having something substantive.
Yeah. Okay, if you don't mind, Dr. Woods, let me push on that for a second. This text is full of what I at first wrestle with as contradictory statements. So he does seem to say that on one hand, but then he says it's even possible, this is on page 2, the second to last paragraph. Why would he then say it's even possible to conduct seminars by the questioning method in which no reading materials at all are used? That jumped out at me as like something new I've never heard him say before. And it does seem to suggest it's opening up the problems that Dr. Woods is speaking of, that we might be talking about shadows if we don't have a text. So have I misunderstood Adler all these years? Why would he say this?
Later on,
Mr. Cray.
Later on in that paragraph, he continues and says, instead the participants can be asked to state what understanding they have of a fundamental idea, such as progress or liberty or justice, and drawing out someone's already held understanding or assumption then provides for much more targeted coaching, or even, if didactic is what is needed, in a small situation, in a limited environment. This would be a way, I guess, to not necessarily have to go through all the didactic and hit on things that people think they already know, but to identify by allowing someone else to express their understanding where the weaknesses are, and then have that be the starting place, more of a student-centered than an information-centered model.
Interesting. Dr. Woods, were you going to reply as well?
No, I was just listening, trying to do what Adler
nodding.
says.
You were listening. Okay.
I think the main reason why conversational learning is such a train wreck for most people is because they would rather talk than listen.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to listen to what others are saying.
That's interesting. This is actually maybe another component that we should bring up. If as just brought up, answers should be laid on the table to begin with, and that's why we have to have some didactic, because if you don't know anything at all, there's no answer to lay on the table. How do we know, once those answers are on the table, when to speak and when to listen? And I ask that because he says, when we go back to this notion of the state of mind on page 4, this first full paragraph, he says that people must not be too submissive or acquiescent.
Mm-hmm.
So another tension here. When do we speak? So not only when do we use each kind of learning, but when we're in Socratic learning, when do we speak and when do we listen? When are we submissive? When are we argumentative? There's a lot of temporal questions here that he seems to bring up. Now we're all going to listen at the same time. That's
Dr. Red Wing, if I can, just
yes,
as I'm thinking through here, even as we're discussing Adler's proposal on education, what we're also seeing in this piece is what we're talking about here. He's laying out the steps to the mature mind, the steps that one must go through in education to reach that level of maturity. But in that, he's also using those same steps as he's laying out the method for education. The very Socratic method we're talking about itself has levels of responsibility, levels of rules per se, guidelines. And as you learn the guidelines for a discussion, you also then learn the guidelines for a mature mind in education in all things. So like on page 3, especially when he talks about the rules of the discussion are important. Everyone involved in the discussion must understand the rules of the moment, the rules of the session. So even in the rules of the session, you lay down the purpose of the session is to come to a understanding or to learn something, to lay that out first. And so when the question is when do we speak, when do we listen, if that is focused on the goal, if you lay down the goal initially, our purpose here is to X, Y, or Z, then you then filter that goal through your response. Okay, if what I'm about to say here adds to the discussion and can be followed up with the text, then I can speak. If all I'm doing is to make myself feel smart, that does not line up with the goal. Or vice versa, if we only want to sit back and be passive, if we're being passive, it's about our feelings rather than the goal of the discussion. So if we focus the response through the criteria of the session, then I think that's a way to begin.
very interesting, very helpful. I will keep asking questions, so you should stop me. Okay, all right. So, well, one of the things that you're suggesting then is how, if we're going to talk about when we speak and when we listen within a Socratic seminar, you mentioned some of the things in the state of mind that we might have to measure when we speak and when we listen. He says on page 3, this is about halfway through the first sentence of the third paragraph from the bottom, he also says it's not a glorified bull session. And he puts that in quotation marks. And I find this very curious, and I'm not sure I know what it means. What is this bull session, and does it kind of back up what you're saying, Mr. Owens? This is for anyone, but yeah.
Yeah, I think so, Dr. Redmond, because here's the thing. The sign of a mature mind, the sign of an educated person, is not someone who just rattles off a lot of words. And so if you're sitting around having a bull session, what you're doing is you're making yourself, I see Mr. Jewell there shooting the bull. Yeah. There has to be some value to what is being contributed. And if you're only just spewing out a lot of words to try to, quote, sound intelligent, then really what you're doing is everyone in the room or in the session looks at you and sees the lack of intelligence instead. So if the goal is to educate, if the goal is for everyone to receive and mature from the process, anything that is not adding to that is just not worth saying, and should be not said. And then that's a level of maturity. Again. So we have this cycle. Everything kind of adds to that and contributes to the goal of the session.
That's great. So he doesn't tell us when, he tells us when not. He answers our question with the negative. That's very interesting. There are other negatives in there. He calls them, in addition to this bull session, which I think was very helpful that we fleshed that out a little bit, he calls them counterfeit seminars. there are several kinds of counterfeit seminars in which we know we're not doing it. What are these counterfeit seminars, and what do they mean to each of us?
I think that this distinction between I guess a counterfeit seminar or a bold session on the one hand and an authentic seminar on the other, I think it's very similar to the distinction perhaps between the more didactic approach to learning and the conversational approach to learning as well. It kind of leads us back in a circle to that. And I think that maybe the key words that I would use here are fact versus meaning. Simply being able to, for instance, I don't know, recite the entire Republic from memory, some of us might go, wow, but at the same time, I wouldn't consider that person a particularly intelligent person, to be honest, because they're not someone that can discuss the meaning of the text, although they may be able to recite it in full.
Excellent. Does anyone want to comment any more about the when before I move us? We probably should. I'm looking at the clock and realizing I need to move us forward and talk about the how a little bit so we can get to Plato. Does anyone have any more comments about when we do Socratic teaching as opposed to the other two kinds of learning, and when we're within a Socratic session, we know that we're doing it and not something counterfeit? I believe, Dr. Stark, you're about ready to say something.
Yeah, actually, and I wonder if perhaps it might be helpful to think of kind of a continuum. And this is kind of going back to Dr. Woods' earlier allusion to the Plato reading that we're going to be discussing in a few minutes, where if we look at just the literary structure of that reading, Plato does an awful lot of talking, and the dialogue is mainly in the vein of yes, I understand, yes, I agree, and so on. So there, it's formally dialogue, but as far as teaching mode classification, it's more didactic than Socratic, perhaps. So, and I wonder also if this kind of gets us back to our earlier question that we were teasing out about the relevance of age in this question, to the effect that you can do maybe formally question-based stuff with folks who are younger with respect to a particular subject matter as a way of keeping them engaged rather than you just droning on for 50 or 100 minutes or however long.
Okay.
I think that's absolutely the case, and I think I see this process of moving from the didactic or the lecture approach through coaching and onto the Socratic dialogue. I think it's a spiral that consists of a bunch of spirals, because you have to keep kind of coming back around to each of those, filling in the facts where necessary. For instance, to use that example of what I'm covering with my own students right now. All week long, it was essentially lectures on early Judaism, culminating in that discussion of Genesis 1. And I don't think without those facts, we wouldn't have been able to have that discussion. And then this is part of a wider unit in ancient Judaism, in history. And so we kind of spiral around, and of course they're in 6th grade. And so, again, they're still getting those facts filled in. They're young. And so they're going to reach the other side of that big spiral when they're, 20, 22, when they're in their college years, hopefully.
Is there a part, or is there a sense in which the non-Socratic, when it stops, not when it continues like what you were just saying, but when it stops, that there is a almost a controlling attitude, or the desire is for a certain species of conformity, as opposed to a guiding and an empowering attitude that is looking for growth to take place. The one demands conformity, but the other demands growth. Is there that kind of tension going on between these? Someone who would, as a teacher, only mature to the point of lecture and never move on to the point of.
I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, in that discussion, I probably said more often than not, because especially at that age, they look to the teacher for the answers, and more often than not, my answer was, I don't know, but that sounds pretty good. What do you think? And so you do have to relinquish, not responsibility, but you have to relinquish a little bit of that control, as you called it.
Well, and it does bring up the issue to me of the moderator and this whole thing, and I love how Adler addresses that. It's on page 6 where he says, "They're the teacher as moderator." Isn't that a great kind of qualification? Should simply be a more competent learner than the student, more competent in the effort to achieve an understanding of whatever materials are to be discussed, and more competent to do this by means of carrying on an intelligent conversation or discussion. And I think that's where, this is why I love this approach to teaching and to learning. And the single greatest distinction to me between a professor who gives a lecture and does not know how to listen to students and actually answer their questions is this distinction right here. That you're able to listen, and you're thinking through what the student is actually hearing you say, and hearing and reading and thinking about, and you're thinking through it, and you're able to respond to them by what Mr. Wuthnow said, and that is, so what do you think? What do you think? And you genuinely care about what they think.
These are I'm sorry.
It was me.
Yes. Yeah, please.
I just wanted to add, it is tempting. It is very tempting, especially with young students who are looking to you for the answers. It's very tempting to be, oh, well, I know everything. Let me dictate this to you. And so there is that. And I think that to perhaps answer Mr. Cray's question, that, and I don't want to insult those who prefer that other form, but it's I would say it's I don't know, a certain sort of weakness that just wants to take control, and you want to dictate it, versus, again, relinquishing that little bit of control and allowing someone to disagree with you, and maybe even to be happy that they do disagree with you because they can support their disagreeing answer.
And it is almost an exercise of docility or teachableness on the instructor's part to kind of be the one disabusing ourselves of our own self-importance, that we have all the answers, and even if we jolly well know that we think we have a good answer for the question, to put ourselves in a position where we relinquish the option of simply asserting our view and instead seek to draw it out from the student. That's a much harder task than simply opining based on what evidence and argument we might typically be comfortable with citing in a particular case.
Excellent. Great string there of comments, because I think you are pushing us towards, okay, how do we do, it's not a lecture in disguise, as he says on page 3. It's this other thing, and we've talked a lot now about when we do it, when Socratic is important, how it fits in our pedagogic approach. We do need to spend a few minutes on this before we go to Plato. What you guys are suggesting to me sounds exhausting, nearly impossible, and incredibly intimidating. That you have to be all of these things and none of these things at the same time, that you exercise some control but not too much, that you give it some direction but not all. How do we do this as Socratic moderators? How does Adler suggest we do this difficult, exhausting thing?
I think Dr. Stark hit on it when he said the moderator or the teacher needs to be teachable. the professors I've encountered over the years that could never do this are those who feel like they know everything, and they have to, as was stated by a couple others, they have to be in control. And this approach to teaching and to learning and to thinking, it is very difficult. And as you said, it's grueling. So there has to be that docility of the moderator that's got to be present, or this will not happen.
And what I see here on what you just said, Dr. Woods, the third paragraph down on page 6, saying that the teacher as leader of a discussion should not regard his competence as consisting in knowing all the right answers to the questions that should be asked and explored. If the Socratic teacher, the leader of the discussion, the moderator, if you will, models himself or herself with the docility of I am teachable, and I'm going to show you how I am teachable, because I am not going to sit here or stand here with all the answers. I'm going to encourage us all to learn from one another, rather than it being just one person with all of the energy and all of the answers and all of the control. By example, the teacher or the moderator will then encourage everyone, all of the students, to do the same. So what we're trying to do is, in this method, is we're not trying to teach facts. We're not trying to instill great great knowledge of many, many small trivial things. What we're trying to teach instead is the ability to learn. And when we model that ourselves, okay, yes, I want to kind of control the discussion and make sure we stay on track, but we're all going to learn from one another. And everyone else who is also learning, they themselves are also learning how to teach, in the fact that they are sharing, that they're learning from someone else, that they didn't know something that they thought of before. And so it's like the energy feeds on itself. And so, yes, it is exhausting. And I love how Adler speaks about that it is more exhausting to lead a discussion than it is to lecture. But then I would argue at the same time, in my experience, I've come away from discussions more energized, not exhausted, because there's so much energy from all participants, and we kind of encourage one another.
I think that's an excellent point about modeling, because and this is especially true of working with young children. They imitate the teacher. They imitate the way we speak. They imitate the way we dress. They imitate the way that we move our bodies, and so we have to model good behavior all the time. And perhaps one thing that many teachers forget to model is learning, is being receptive, is listening, which should be one of the most important things. And I want to add as well, in regards to this being exhausting, Adler says very much the same thing in that last paragraph on page 4. About midway through the paragraph, he says, it's quite easy to give 2 or 3 good lectures in a single day, but I seriously doubt that anyone has enough energy to conduct more than one good seminar between sunrise and sunset. So I think that he acknowledges it is exhausting to be on stage, doing that modeling of something that is difficult in itself. To be a good listener is sometimes exhausting, and certainly to, for just a moment, renounce our own passionate love affair with our own opinions is also exhausting. Many exhausting things happening simultaneously.
Excellent.
Well, one of the things that is also in speaking to modeling that we've seen when we've done this. As a teacher, one of the things that turns me on the most is when someone in the room says something that I have not thought of before, and it just carries my passion for the subject and for learning in general forward. And as a student, when I see that from some of my tutors, I see that same reaction in them that I felt myself. It gives me hope that this learning and this joy of learning and this ability to cultivate and move closer and closer toward what it is that we should be becoming in thinking Christianly, that that encourages me to see people who've been at this game 20 years longer than I am still passionate about it. And in traditional lecture courses, you don't always get that sense that you know, the lecturer standing up front is still passionate. They're well informed, maybe, but they don't. That passion doesn't communicate in the same way.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm holding my head because you've just now collectively blown my mind for the day. So, I mean, the kinds of things you're saying, you know, if you want to teach, you should learn. If you want to talk, you should listen. I mean, he seems to be answering again and again all these questions of when and how in very different and I think interesting ways for us as educators. If everyone agrees, the other hard part about moderating outside of being in control but not too much is this temporal aspect. He says we should do a good 2-hour discussion, and we're definitely going to do that. But I want to do my diligence and push us at least to the other texts so we can now, because they talk to each other. So now, thank you all. That was a wonderful fleshing out of the general precepts of what Adler says. Now let's go to Socrates himself and see, I think Dr. Stark wanted to take us there as well, whether this is the same thing Adler's talking about. So I've got a question to begin our discussion of Book 7 of Plato's Republic, and we'll see where it ends up. Let's see what you guys do with it. That was great. Okay, on page 2 of this reading, Plato suggests that last of all, a prisoner, I'm trying to see where this is. Yeah, it's on page 2, will be able to see the sun and not mere reflections of him in the water, but he will see him in his own proper place and not in another, and he will contemplate him as he is. So he seems to be suggesting or describing what happens when a prisoner or a learner actually learns something. I just don't know exactly what it means. It's a very difficult. Has everyone found where the actual passage is?
Let me begin with something that may surprise everyone here. I was, and I have the utmost respect for Dr. Redwing. When I first started reading this or rereading it, because I've read it before in other contexts, I thought, why did he pick this reading?
That's right.
When I got to the end, I thought, okay, I think I have a better sense. But after the last 45 minutes, I have a very good sense on why you picked this reading, or at least I think.
Tell us, because I don't know. So tell me.
Well, I want to reserve my thoughts on how and why this is really a perfect complement to the Adler piece. But I want to reserve my thoughts. But I mean, maybe everyone else start off and say, "Oh no, this is perfect. I knew it was perfect in the first minute or two." But it wasn't until the end that it started dawning on me what the relationship is between the kind of conversational learning and this, and the allegory of the cave, and then the ensuing discussion after that. So.
Excellent. And how perfect that you're using language like dawning, right? It's dawning
yes, right.
on you. Maybe that's a better place to start. The problem is I always pick a place where I'm curious. I think, Dr. Woods, you're suggesting a different place of curiosity. Let's go there instead. Show us where it began to dawn on you that there was some correlation between these readings, or something where you had this aha moment of what Socrates might be suggesting. So we're going to ignore my question and go with yours.
Well, okay, and I actually would like, I mean, if I may be the only one that had that, running around in the cave looking at the shadows and not making any connections. So, but if somebody else, but I think that's a great question. Where does one start seeing these connections between what Adler's saying about conversational learning and what Plato is saying about education?
There you go. Yeah, that's a better first question. Let's do that. So where do we begin to see connections in these texts? And if you could point us to a passage, that'll be a better entrance point. Anyone can do this. It doesn't have to be Dr. Woods. I didn't mean to keep you on the spot there.
Well, for me, I had much the same sense initially that Dr. Woods has just expressed, but the connections.
Yeah, that's great.
Connections started pinging quite a lot on, for instance, like page 5. The paragraph beginning with the ellipses, and so Glaucon, I said, in the middle of that paragraph, he starts talking about dialectic and how there's this kind of give and take that's to be expressed in the process of these people coming to knowledge, and that to me seemed to be in my own trying to understand what the relationship is between putting these two readings together, that seemed to be a major point of connection between the two, is the give and take both in the kind of educational process that's being proposed here in Plato and in Adler as well.
Excellent. Can you point, is there a sentence or two in that passage where things are starting to make connections that you could read for us that would give us some language of Plato's to begin to play around with?
Oh, sure. Yeah, if we look at I think it's the third sentence there. And so with dialectic, when a person starts on the discovery of the absolute by the light of reason only and without the assistance of sense, and perseveres until by pure intelligence he arrives at the perception of the absolute good, he at last finds himself at the end of the intellectual world, as is the case of sight at the end of the visible. And there was one other that was, and then at the bottom of page 6 is perhaps the other one that's maybe most immediately relevant here. And so do you also agree, I said, in describing the dialectician as one who attains a conception of the essence of each thing? And then Glaucon replies in the affirmative, of course.
Yeah.
I think one of the things going on also is this does model and, in a sense, demonstrates the difficulty that can be had in the dialectic or the conversational learning. Most learners today, and quite possibly back then, were used to being lectured to. And I think Socrates kind of starts in that fashion, and it takes him 5 pages until finally Glaucon says, "What do you mean?" And we have this question from the learner. And I think that, and getting to that point, is fundamental, and it's one of the great difficulties, is not just to be open and available for somebody to ask you a question, but to actually speak in such a way that it invites that. And I mean, Glaucon is pretty helpless. He has to know at this point, what do you mean? And from there, he asks a couple more questions, but at that point, his mind is ready. And I find it interesting that it takes 5 pages for it to get to that point. And I think it's if nothing else, it's an allegory of the difficulty of this type of teaching. But yet, at the end of the fruit.
Yeah, 5 pages sounds good to me. I've been trying for 40 years, and I'm still not there. So that's, but that I've never actually heard that before. That is such an interesting read, that Socrates is getting the didactic teaching out of his own system, that he also doesn't understand what he's doing at the beginning of the discussion. He learns it too. That's interesting.
And I also do have a sense that It's crazy, but over the years, I've spent so much time on the actual allegory of the cave that I've given very little attention to what follows. But after you make your way through what follows, it does loop you back naturally into the meaning of the allegory of the cave, and that the essence of education is, at least in part from Adler and Plato in these two readings, is I think Mr. Cray just said it perfectly, getting the student to that point where he or she says, what do you mean? And there's that openness, and then they are now involved in the process of understanding, which I do think, whether we are looking at Adler's 3 columns or whether we're looking at Plato here on page 6 or Socrates on page 6, where he talks about science, understanding, belief, and opinion. And the 2 for intellect and 2 for opinion. The first division, science, which we know primarily meant our senses, and then the second, understanding. So there's something going on, there when it comes to what education is.
So are you suggesting that as we're like digging deeper into what this dialectic is that we've been started down with, that sight or observation, this scientific idea, why does that have to come before understanding? So you've mentioned those, those 2 columns right there. Why does science come first?
Would it maybe be that is the acquisition of knowledge, of organized knowledge, and we acquire it through maybe the lectures, the dispensing of information from other people. I experience it myself with my own senses, but that doesn't mean, I think, as Mr. Withen said earlier, I'm not getting what it means yet. I'm moving from what was the term that you used, Mr. Withen? You move from this to understanding. You remember what you said earlier? Okay.
No, I think the terminology I used was fact versus meaning, and
that's it. Yes, that's it. So I've moved from the organize, this data, this information, these facts, to the meaning of all of this.
Dr. Woods, on that section that you were just talking about on page 6, if I could please add to some comments that you made. I made some notes there as well. When I saw this, it was almost as if Socrates was comparing the scientific method with his dialectic method. And almost the way I read that paragraph was that the dialectic method is higher and brings out understanding, whereas the scientific method does not. Am I misreading that, or is that what you see?
I think that's a good question. Let's all grapple with that and see, because I'll be honest, I've reread this dozens of times over the years, but I always get bogged down about the same place. And this is one of those places where I genuinely get bogged down.
I'm a bit confused myself, and I think I'm maybe confused about the same thing that Mr. Owens is, and that is on page 5. In fact, one of the first things that we looked at, that paragraph that begins with the ellipses and so Glaucon, he says, when a person starts on the discovery of the absolute by the light of reason only and without any assistance of the sense, and then he goes on, and then I believe it's on the following page, as Dr. Wood pointed out, he says on the next page that science, or knowledge provided by the senses, is kind of this necessary prerequisite. And so I'm kind of confused over, I don't know, the two. Is he saying that is necessary or that it's not?
One, I don't know, maybe point of analogy that just came to my mind as I think Dr. Woods was talking in particular, but that may help with a couple of these comments is, for instance, learning a foreign language. If you don't know Greek and you look at Plato in Greek, all you actually see are signs on a page. You might presume that it's Greek, but you don't actually know the language, so you can't see it as a language. Only once you see it as a language can you then make the progression to discussing the meaning of that language that's on the page that you now see.
And there would be multiple tiers to that too. That wouldn't just be, I've learned that, going back to Trivium, the grammar first, and then this coaching process moving on towards the true and full understanding of that logical connection has to be pursued through the text, or it could be anything, but in this case the text, and but that's just one layer of learning. So did I hear you correctly? What you're saying is there's the skill set, and then applying that skill set to the text to acquire or to draw out what's there. But then what he's calling for here in the cave is to move beyond to a realization of what that means, not just that it is.
Yeah, that sounds like a fair summary. Like Dr. Woods was suggesting earlier, you have to see before you have the raw material to reason about what it is that you see. And I was just looking too on page 6. Then oh dear. Well, it's the paragraph that begins, "Then dialectic and dialectic alone." Goes directly to the first principle is the only science, which is an interesting hook into what we've just been discussing, which does away with hypotheses in order to make our ground secure. So the learning process, once we have that initial sight of the content that we're discussing, is, or seems to be, as far as Socrates is concerned here, a way of going back behind what we think we know to what it actually is that we do know, until we finally arrive at that, which frequently isn't what we thought it was.
That's right. Yeah.
Do you think this is related to or similar to Adler's assertion that you can conduct a seminar or a Socratic dialogue without a text?
Explain more.
This is kind of the same idea, that you don't need, that there are perhaps certain topics that you don't need any background knowledge to approach. You don't need that foundation in fact to advance the meaning. If there are some things you can just start off there.
Are those things the other things he's talking about? Because we've talked about one side of the equation, which is intellect, which he seems to suggest is both science or senses and understanding, didactic and Socratic, it sounds in general ways. But he also talks about opinion in terms of both belief and shadow. Is that the other thing you're talking about, that there's certain things, or is this not helpful? It's so hard to know when to use analogy and allegory here and when not to.
I don't know, because I think that once you get into the realm of opinion, aren't you almost getting into another one of those bowl sessions? Depending on, well, not all opinion, but I don't know. I think if you take that too far, you end up in one of those full seminars or those bowl sessions.
Good. So what are his kinds of opinion, and how do they differ? And anyone can help here, and that's an unfair question. I shouldn't have just put that right on you. I can point us to the text, and I'll just go from there. So this is page 6, 1, 2, the third paragraph from the bottom. Maybe, Mr. Withen, you could just read that for us, and that'll get us started. And then it's meant in conjunction with trying to help us understand where those discussions are where we don't need a text.
Third paragraph from the bottom, but let us defer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Page 6. Oh, I'm counting my paragraphs wrong. It's the one that starts at any rate.
At any rate, we are satisfied as before to have 4 divisions: 2 for intellect and 2 for opinion. and to call the first division science, the second understanding, the third belief, and the fourth perception of shadows, opinion being concerned with becoming, and intellect with being, and so to make a proportion.
And I wouldn't even make you read the next sentence, but this is the one where I have like 4 stars. I have no idea what it means.
As being,
yeah, read that one.
As being is to becoming, so is pure intellect to opinion, and as intellect is to opinion, so is science to belief, and understanding to the perceptions of shadows.
Yeah. As Dr. Wood suggests, there's always a point. Every year I get stuck in this text. That's my point. And it seems something to do with... Yeah, go ahead, please.
This is when I usually say, okay, who thinks they get this?
I think that's the best question. Who thinks they get this? That's great.
Who wants to take us by the hand and move us away from the shadow on this one?
Well, isn't part of what he's suggesting here is that one of the, if not the highest thing to learn is how to recognize when something is shadow. Not necessarily that you understand the truth, but at least you understand what is shadow. Is that part of what he's driving? I mean, that kind of seems like Socrates in a nutshell to me as far as his overall method in quest, but is that a possible reading that was at least helpful and not a shadow?
I don't know. I'm still stuck. More people need to talk to see if we can. We need to throw a lot at this, I'm afraid.
Mr. Cray, are you saying there are like, I don't know, there's almost a hierarchy of opinion? Is that?
I don't know if it was this work or another one, but it was in one of the tutorials that Dr. Woods took me through, and this idea of opinion versus right opinion. And right opinion being just happening to be right, but not necessarily knowing why it's true versus true knowledge and understanding. And the shadow part, it seems to me, of where he says, and understanding to the perception of shadows, at least you understand that this is a shadow and not reality. And that in itself is a huge step.
You know,
the language you use is right belief. Is that what you said? Right belief?
Right opinion. I don't believe it's in this. Yeah.
Okay.
Right opinion.
Okay.
Well, and to kind of confirm what your thinking is on that, Mr. Cray, it does seem to me that that's essentially what's going on in the allegory of the cave early on, with the realization that up until a certain point, everyone in the cave thought the shadows were what was real. And so that would be, where would that be? Then that would be the opinion. Is that right? Wait, yes, right?
Which he also helpfully calls on page 2 the wisdom of the den.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Which we would say the wisdom of the den, right?
Exactly. And he may be, but we don't see.
Right.
I had stumbled over this as well, and I think for me, part of it is because for some reason, in reading the text as it's printed here, I had kind of a mental hang-up and was flipping the analogies that actually seem to be there on the page, and reading the text as though it said, as becoming is to being, so yada yada, and follows. But now, just kind of listening to you all and thinking through it some more, I wonder if, coming back into that previous paragraph that begins at any rate, 2 for intellect and 2 for opinion. 2 for intellect, namely science and understanding. 2 for opinion, namely belief and perception of shadows. Then in the following paragraph, as intellect is to opinion, so those 2 categories vis-a-vis the other 2, so science, namely the first category of intellect, is to the first category of opinion, and understanding, the second category of intellect, to the perception of shadows, the second category of opinion. So is he proposing a kind of progression in each of these categories? Is that what the interlocking is doing? Or I'm just, in other words, is the text trying to get us to understand that perception of shadows can, as an opinion, can lead to an intellectual experience of understanding, and belief in something, as an opinion, can lead to an intellectual experience of science, which, I don't know, I guess here seems to be maybe true knowledge, or more, I don't know, is it set off as something more robust than just some kind of understanding?
This is the first time I've ever understood that. Thank you.
Could you explain it to me then, please?
Well, I don't know.
I'm
I'm just
sure.
going to ask. It goes to back. Actually, it's what you said at the very beginning in the last discussion. So if you're saying science is equated, that there's a dialectic between, we'll call it sense, and belief, and understanding and shadow, that's why he spends 5 pages engaging Glaucon's belief. Do you believe this? Yes. Do you believe that? Yes. And it's only when he begins to understand that he finally sees a shadow, something he doesn't understand, and he says, what do you mean? That now we've gone into the realm of understanding. So he's playing off of his belief so he can see, and playing off of his shadows so he can understand. Yeah, and you're the first. I've never heard those terms put next to each other like that, even though that's exactly what the text says. I don't. How did we miss that? So,
it's always helpful for us to read what's actually on the page.
Yeah.
No, but that's very helpful, because he does refer to. Let's see, I'm trying to find it, but early on, it seems. Let's see, the bottom of page 3, the paragraph, let's see, 4th up from the bottom. Moreover, I said, you must not wonder that those who attain to this beatific vision are unwilling to descend to. So it's the educators who actually do now have a kind of blessed sight that has progressed from kind of the beliefs that they've been wont to hold. They've moved from that to actually seeing the reality, that are called to, I don't know, maybe not just stay up there in the ivory tower thinking about how wonderful they are to have discovered this, but to actually engage folks.
Yes. There's going to be comment on this, right? So basically your question is, if we're muddling down here and we finally understand what's happening in the den as wisdom of the den, and we get out of it, why in the world do we want to go back in the den?
And is the wisdom of the den, then, is it our opinion grounded in perception? Is that how you all read that? I'm genuinely throwing that out, because going along with what Dr. Stark was saying, I was drawing a little diagram here to try to help myself understand this a little better. And so, would that be the wisdom of the den, or maybe the wisdom of the den is the perception, opinion rooted in perception, or opinion rooted in belief,
or belief rooted in opinion.
Belief rooted in opinion. Okay. So in other words, I believe that these shadows on the wall are real because that's the opinion of everyone. Is that the evidence? Is that kind of borne out in the text, where there is a belief that everyone has in the den because it's the opinion of everyone in the den?
Well, that would kind of
Yeah.
get to that would get to when he goes back and is ridiculed by those who's, well, of course that's a horse. That's not a shadow. You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what reality is, and it's the one person in the room who actually does understand.
That's good.
And also on page 3, he unpacks the allegory for us as we start to struggle, and he says the prison house is the world of sight. Doesn't that back up what you're saying, Dr. Woods, that to be a prisoner is to be without sight?
Or wait, the prison house is the world of sight or a world without sight?
Oh, the world of. So the prisoner is only one with. Is that what that means? What does that mean then?
I would think that's it. That the prisoner is the one who is, and this is what I'm still trying to wrap my mind around. Is the prisoner is the one driven by opinion or guided by opinion, rooted in perception and belief.
Yeah.
And so it's all a part of the den of wisdom there. So
Yeah.
I think, but I definitely would concede I could be missing something here. It's just my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's so let's go with this line of this is a whole big other branch of inquiry for this text then. It is, what exactly is this? I mean, it's a more general question, but what is this den? We've talked a lot about how we get out of it, but we haven't talked about what the den is, and we haven't talked about Dr. Stark's question of why we'd want to go back in it once we got out. So, Dr. Woods, you're suggesting then that the den is what? Say it one more time for us so we can begin to wrestle with that part of where we need to go.
That the den is that way of the formation of our opinions rooted in belief and perception, and that's the den that we're living in. That's the den we dwell in.
And just something that may help, that may go along with that too. On the top of page 4, the paragraph, the very first paragraph there, beginning "anyone who has common sense will remember." There, Plato teases out sight as with the physical eyes and as a metaphor for understanding. Mm. So the prison. So is that perhaps a way of dividing or distinguishing the two intellectual experiences that he's outlined, whereas one is in the cave and it's a prison house, and the other is outside the cave and you're breathing free air? But they're both a kind of sight.
Hmm.
You've done it again. You've taken me to this part of the text I was hoping we wouldn't talk about. There was a place I'm existentially perturbed by, and it's right where you're reading and before. Is he suggesting that there is another place below the den? Bottom of page 3. He said, okay, here's my exclamation. I'd never heard this before. Now that you point this out, Dr. Stark, I read this and I'm worried. And is there anything surprising in one who passes from divine contemplation to the evil state of man, misbehaving himself in a ridiculous manner, if while his eyes are blinking and before he has become accustomed to the surrounded darkness, he's compelled to fight in the courts and is endeavoring? There's some other spot going on here. What's this evil state of man? That doesn't seem to be the den.
Dr. Redwing, let me kind of give my 2 cents worth here, if it has any value. As I'm listening here, here's what I'm trying to understand, and what I think I may understand here on page 3. When we begin, and we're going to come back to your paragraph at the bottom, but when we begin about halfway through the page where it says, the prison house is the world of sight. The light of the fire is the sun. If you take that and add it to the last paragraph there, the text is what I see. He's talking about work and effort are required to see the truth. So perhaps where man begins in our ignorance, the cave is our ignorance.
Okay.
The shackles are holding us from the truth of the sun because we're in this dark cave and that's all we know. And it's perhaps our ignorance has value. Perhaps the evil state of man has value in that compared to the truth that we eventually see when we gain understanding is how we understand that something is true. So without the den, without that dark cave, to contrast with the bright light that we're coming out to, we will not struggle and see the difference. And so the struggle that he's talking about here, as you come out of the cave here at the bottom of page 3, and is there anything surprising in one who passes from divine contemplations to the evil state of man, misbehaving himself in a ridiculous manner, if while his eyes are blinking and before he has become accustomed to the surrounding darkness, he is compelled to fight in courts of law or in other places about the images or the shadows of the images of justice, and is endeavoring to meet the conceptions of those who have never yet seen absolute justice. He's struggling with what he thought he knew. He's fighting with the dark past that he started with. He's fighting that with this newfound revelation of the light. And so this tension and this struggle he's going through is what allows him to learn, allows him to understand, allows him to grow and see the truth rather than the lies that he thought was the truth in the cave. So there's value in that cave. There's value in the darkness. It causes us to struggle and to fight so that we eventually will see and appreciate, for no other word, the beauty of knowledge that we eventually see. So you have to have the dark and the light. You have to have the ugly and the beautiful. You have to have the dark cave with the bright sun. It's a contrast, and without the two working together, there is no learning, there is no understanding.
That's great. So you're saying the dialectic occurs within?
The dialectic occurs, yeah, within, but with also, as a result of the outside stimuli, the struggle that you're going through. You've got this outside stimulus showing you something that's true, and the inside perception that you have, the two are competing. And that's where you build muscle. You build your intellectual stamina. You're gaining strength, whereas before you were shackled and weak in the dark cave. And now all of a sudden you're coming out inside, and your eyes are blinking and struggling with what you see, but eventually you get used to it. And so this process of learning is a struggle. You've got the two extremes helping one another, if nothing else.
So you're saying the wisdom of the den is the gymnasium of the soul?
Yeah, sure. I love that. I love that.
That's, wow. What do people, that is quite an amazing contention Mr. Owens is making. What do people think of this? I feel like we're opening this a little bit, maybe.
I'm seeing it just a little bit different. I see what's being described here, and I may be wrong, but what I see is what's being described here is that person who is making that transition from the den to the everyday world, and as it says, passes from divine contemplations to the evil state of man. That is, he's out now and about with the people who are still in the den. All right, so I'm kind of jumping from metaphor to real world. So they are the blind people who are all around, who are talking about things like what is justice. And here he's in the process of coming to understand what justice is, but he's having to talk about what justice is with all these people who are still looking at the shadows on the wall, saying, there it is, there it is. And so this is the way I envision what's going on here.
So he's talking about, he's thinking about the good while they're talking about justice.
There you go. Or he is moving toward understanding justice while they're talking about shadow justice.
Ah.
Right. Yeah. So, Dr. Woods, I agree. They're competing with their perception of truth. I want to go back to the very first line of Republic, Book 7, on page 1. He introduces this whole dialogue, and I think this can become a way of understanding the rest. Socrates says, "And now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened." So he begins with a contrast of two opposites: enlightenment or unenlightenment, light or dark. He starts out with that. So I think that's kind of the basis he goes with throughout this entire dialogue. There's a competition here.
Is there a sense in which, speaking about enlightenment and unenlightenment, or enlightened or unenlightened, I'm wondering if the evil that's taking place here on page 3 is that, like Dr. Woods was saying, he's come back into the cave. He's been enlightened, but immediately going back into the cave, he can't adjust, and so he's faced with trying to fight a fight that he's blind as to how to fight this fight, because he has not readjusted to the darkness. And the danger is that he becomes unenlightened, that he comes back into this everyday world of the den, and the false wisdom there overwhelms him because he's disoriented. He's out of balance with okay, maybe he comes to even doubt that he ever left the cave. And so would there be anything quite as evil as going out and becoming enlightened and going back and trying to engage and losing that enlightenment, or choosing, rather, instead of turning back around and going out and getting some more truth and then coming back and continue that process of the back and forth, of just choosing to stay in the cave and to give up the liberty of truth for the slavery that exists in the cave, and to be aware that you've chosen slavery.
So if that's true, and this helps me understand page 4, where he says you're describing the turn of the vision from their souls back upon the things that are below, that they're re-enticed or re-tempted by the wisdom of the den, by the cave. So the question is, why would an enlightened person go back down anyway? Because Plato seems to suggest not only might he must. If it's so dangerous, why do you have to go back down in the cave?
There are real things in the cave. The people are real. I mean, what they're perceiving isn't, but there are real things in the cave to go back into, to try to claim or to try to help discover even themselves.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going, Jeff. On page 3, this entire allegory, that paragraph that we've just kind of been mulling over, the second line there, one of the assertions that, or interpretation points that Plato gives, is that the light of the fire is the sun, which it actually isn't, because there's fire in the cave and the sun is outside. But what this has just kind of sparked is Plato suggesting that actually inside or outside the cave doesn't make a whole lot of difference. The point is that you see the things that are illumined by the light that is present. In other words, where Mr. Cray, the fall, if we can kind of put it that way, of the person who's experienced the outside in coming back inside is not in coming back inside. Plato's urging the folks actually to do that, but to come inside and look at the shadows. If they're going to come inside, they should look at the things that the light is actually illumining, not at the kind of reverberations that the shadowy background stuff. So it just strikes me that the light is maybe here being regarded as the same in both places.
You know, you caught my attention there when you said that when you talked about the fire versus the sun, because I was actually looking, and when you said that at the bottom of page 5, the last full paragraph on the page, and he says the images are cast by the light of fire, which compared with the sun is only an image. And so I don't know how much that has to do with what you're saying, but I think that it is related, that the fire is in a way a shadow of the sun, or an image of the sun.
So are we arguing that light is light regardless of the source, or are we saying that there's a difference between the two sources of light?
I think there's a difference. I think that and maybe this may be a bad analogy, and I might be very, very wrong, but it seems that the shadows are to the item casting the shadow as the fire is to the sun.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I hadn't remembered that part on page 5. Yeah, though still, even once we take page 5 into account, the function of the shadowy light that's in the cave is the same as the function of the sunlight that's outside, isn't it? With respect to the folks who are in either place.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I think that perhaps that says something about your point, that maybe they are the same thing in some sense.
Let me throw in here again, going back to what we talked about earlier, the 4 divisions now. I wonder how this might relate to the 4 divisions of intellect, opinion, and then the intellect, science, sense, and understanding, and opinion, belief, and perception.
Why are you thinking that?
Well, just as I was listening to both of them speak just then, it dawned on me that there is something going on even in the den of wisdom, and now I'm questioning whether or not maybe Socrates wasn't being sarcastic. There is a way these people they're knowing something. What they're knowing is not ultimately real and true, but they are knowing something, and their knowing ought not to be completely discounted, because the whole process of understanding is moving them from what they think they know that's not ultimately real to what they ought to know what is real.
Mr. Owens, he's got something from what you just said.
Well, on page 4, we see in the first, the second, third paragraph there, beginning, whereas our argument. Whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already. He's arguing that, and which I think is what Dr. Woods was just pointing out, that the ability to learn is there. So we should not discredit what is already present in the mind, in the soul. We're not trying to create something new out of nothing. We're not trying to grow wisdom out of nothing. We're not God. We're not creating ex nihilo. There is a spark already in man of knowledge that exists in the soul already. So our purpose is to cultivate that, which goes back to Adler. Mm-hmm. Correct? It's already there. From a Christian perspective, we could say the Imago Dei, created in the image of God. That image of God is in man, no matter how low we fall. It's still there in some form. And to cultivate that and to grow that is the purpose of what we're trying to do here.
So you've just gave the philosophical grounding for didactic teaching. Or I'm sorry, Socratic versus didactic.
Okay, there you go.
Right, because it's already there. That's interesting. Mr. Cray.
Well, that reminds me of, Socrates speaks of himself in another place as a, what is it? handmaiden, I guess you might call it, or the
Midwife, yeah.
midwifery, and the myoetic part taking place there. I am struck by something, and I have never even really considered this, but stepping back from everything so far, where does Socrates start us off? Going back to what Bryant did and going to the very beginning, he says, "Let me show you this. Behold." And the first thing that Glaucon says, his first response is, "I see." And we're able, with whatever available light is in the cave, standing beside Socrates, who is, he has been in and out of this cave enough to know what's in there. We're able, standing beside him and him showing us these things, to see these people imprisoned. And we learn from Socrates, as the one who's been in and out of the cave a whole lot, to recognize. And so, in a sense, he's taking us on a journey he's been on several times before. And the first thing that we've got to come to grips with is this: that Glaucon said, I see. And in seeing that, we recognize there's enough light in the cave to see the truth that's there, which gets back to in the enslavement, an enslavement by choice versus a true enslavement. Well, enslavement by choice would be a worse enslavement. But these who are there enslaved, and their head is fixed, and all they can do is look up. We're standing away and beside them, observing this total scene with Socrates. And I've never seen that before, and it may recast the way that I read this in the future completely. That he is taking us on a journey he's been on several times before, and his role as teacher is to show us these subtleties, and to show us the subtleties in the dark, take us out to the light, get us good and blinded, but bring us back in and show us that we can still operate here, and we can make the journey back and forth. And I don't know if the purpose is as much personal enlightenment. It may be in that growth that happens by the exercise, or if there's an underground railroad thing going on here, of going back for those things which are real and bringing them into the reality that in which they truly belong, or what's going on there. But Socrates is guiding us here in a way that I've never recognized before, and he is that teacher mentor that I think Adler wants us to aspire to and to move towards.
You just changed the way I read. I was saying that was totally different at the beginning. Now are you suggesting then that when Glaucon says "I see," that Socrates isn't teaching to him didactically, he's reminding him?
He may be reminding him. I hadn't thought of that, but just the
because
fact
in the next sentence is, "And do you see?" He keeps doing it, right? He's not saying, "Let me tell you." It's almost like he's saying, "And do you remember? And do you see?" And this talks to your notion of like this movement, right?
Yeah, it's also interesting that this whole thing takes place in the imagination.
Yeah. So how does Plato suggest that if we need our imagination to live in the wisdom of the den, what is the gymnasium? This is going back to Mr. Owen's analogy. What's the gymnasium for our imagination while we're in the den? It's not sight anymore, because we already have it. If you are one of these, I don't know what we even want to call it, a returned prisoner, I think you might call it.
Well, I would argue, Dr. Redwing, that in the den there was no room for gymnasium or movement. You were limited.
Okay.
Remember,
So
you're chained up. You're in a confined space, so there is no room for exercise.
So, but what if you are, as Mr. Cray is suggesting, you're on this, I'd like the Underground Railroad analogy. What do you do to make sure when you're in the den that your sights are fixed upon the highest possible things that are in the den? I think Dr. Wood said something about that too, that while we're in the den we must focus on the highest of the things within it. Does that, no? Not making sense. I can tell
Aren't the highest things in the den the human beings that he says, behold, human beings?
Okay.
It really is fascinating to me, and I've never thought about this before, but it is where he begins. It is where Socrates begins with humans in this particular condition, and then he moves from there, but not in some elitist sense of once you get out, you just leave them all there. It is go back if you can. I mean, go back to get them in the state that they're in.
And he does that through this thing called dialectic, which we've now kind of already unpacked.
Which I think we've also been doing for the better part of the last hour. So.
Yeah, 2 hours actually already. Oh, speaking of which, look at this. We only have about 10 minutes left, and I don't know about you, but we could talk for 6 days, right? I feel like I've seen both of these texts in new and deeper ways, but I always like to end with a little bit of play. We've got about 10 minutes or so now, and this is what Dr. Woods, I think, wanted to do at the beginning. What are the links between these two texts? How do Adler and Plato talk to each other? And I think we can even be a little evaluative or applicable in the last 10 minutes in the name of play. And so I'll ask it, how do these two readings relate, and how do they change us as teachers?
Well, I know that when I'm experiencing the prisoner side of lecture, so that would be one connection.
Yeah, that's great.
I let me throw in. That was great. That was really great.
Yeah.
We've all been prisoners to that at some point. But the whole issue of, and I know it's in the Socratic dialogue, but if I enter that text and dwell there, I do see a docility on Glaucon's behalf that I would want to emulate. And it does seem to me, and I think you, Dr. Red Wing, pointed it out brilliantly, this process, it shows us what Adler talks about. And so I would want to be more like Socrates as the mentor, and maybe not as heavy-handed as he is here in places, but as Glaucon as the student, docile and listening.
Excellent. Other reflections, comparisons, connections?
I've just been reflecting on page, what is this, page 5 of the Plato reading, where we've got the bit about the folks who've been out of the cave can't be allowed to just stay outside. They have to be compelled to come in. And then in the paragraph, you have again forgotten, my friend, I said, the intention of the legislator who did not aim at making any one class of the state happy above the rest, the happiness was to be in the whole state, and he held the citizens together by persuasion and necessity, making them benefactors of the state, and therefore benefactors of one another. And this is, again, going back to earlier about reading what's actually on the page, not beneficiaries of the state, but it's these people are all contributing themselves to their common community. And so bouncing that off of Adler, I wonder if as educators, and this is going back to Mr. Owen's point earlier, we need to be mindful of what is actually the goal in whatever kind of engagement we're having, and open to doing whatever it is that is going to help the community of learners of which we're a part at that point reach that goal, whether it's supplying additional content or information, or realizing that us being talking heads isn't always going to help things kind of come together and solidify in the minds of the pupils that are sitting there.
And I'd not read that language either. That language of binding up the state is interesting. So you're saying his suggestion is that process that's dialectic binds us together in the learning process.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I hadn't gotten down that far in that paragraph either. But yeah, that seems to be an excellent extension.
Okay, I'm reading body language here. People.
I think that maybe if there's one thing that both texts is kind of the take home for me, is that the best teacher is the best learner. Is someone who's willing to listen, who's willing to ask questions, and who knows the right questions to ask, and knows those questions because he's listening, and because he's a fellow seeker, you might say. I think that's what makes Socrates such a powerful teacher, and really almost the perfect teacher, if there ever was one, is that he was a fellow truth seeker. He wasn't somebody that was trying to convince anyone of anything in particular, just someone who was honestly searching for the truth and looking for others to take on the ride with him.
Very good. Excellent. Mr. Owens? No?
Well, I'm kind of wrestling with a couple of things.
I could tell something, but I wasn't sure what it was. So if you're not, please, I didn't want to put you on the spot either.
No, that's okay, Dr. Red Wing. For the sake of brevity, let me just kind of focus on one.
Okay.
Adler speaks of the state of mind, and that was his focus there. And I think Socrates, in Plato's dialogue, same thing. Even though there was physical constraints on those in the cave, and then even once someone's released and come out of the cave into the bright light, there's physical discomfort. The focus of both pieces that we're reading at here is the mind. The mind is growing, or the mind is struggling to grow. The mind is being exercised. Even when we're chained up in that cave, what can be exercised is the mind. If the physical body is constrained, at least there's something in the intellect that can be stimulated and grown. And so I think, if nothing else, the two pieces that we've looked at here, we can focus on that one dynamic. Like I keep saying, we have to stay on one focus, one channel, and the mind. Yeah.
Interesting. And on page 5, it seems to suggest that when you're in the cave, that one focus is the second to last paragraph on page 5, the study and pursuit of the arts, which is quite interesting. That's great. Dr. Jewell, I know that you're trying to do a lot at once, but I see you're with us, and I know you've been listening. I had to at least offer the microphone once. Do you have any comments or reflections or ideas? And if it's putting you on the spot, please just pass.
No, I'd just like to say that I was curious, like Dr. Woods, as why you might initially chose to juxtapose these two readings, but listening through to the discussion and all of that, I really did get a lot out of it. So I want to thank everybody for their comments, even though I wasn't able to participate actively.
Very good. Anyone else? A few last. Oh yes, Mr. Cray. That you don't want to leave that one on the table. You got to share that one.
I don't.
Yeah.
I come again to as a reader in Socrates. I think I've recognized myself when he says, "Behold, humans," that I am, in the first reading, I am one of these who are chained and looking at the wall. And on page 2, when he says, "And now look again and see what will naturally follow if the prisoners are released and disabused of their error," because I've had this question in my mind: who has released this prisoner that he's able to go out and discover this? And I think that we have Glaucon, we have Socrates, and then we have ourselves being released and taken with them on this journey to explain what happened. And the purpose, and I think this goes to what Adler is talking about and what he is advocating throughout, the purpose of being taken out and enlightened is to go back in and enlighten others. and to invite others on this journey. And it's never to stay, it's never to arrive, but it's always to be in motion. And if we're going to be anything useful, how can we be anything but in motion in this process, both in our own learning and in being compassionate enough to try to help others, whether they listen or not, which I think is part of what's going on in the cave too. And obviously knowing the history of Adler, whether they listen or not, whether America's education system is reformed or not, you still have to say what you have to say because it's right and it's true.
I am so glad you didn't hold that in, because I think you remember that very first big enigma ahead of, like, as being is to becoming. This speaks very much to what you're saying, that in a sense is the dialectic. It's between already being and becoming. And once you're one, you need to go back to the other, whatever it is. Thank you. That was wonderful. That was wonderful. Any more comments? Dr. Stark, Mr. Withen, Dr. Woods, I'll save the last words for you, so you may maybe share a few things with whoever might be watching about our program. Dr. Stark, Mr. Withen, not yet doctor, sorry. Any last comments? We ready to go? Okay. We don't want to leave something, Mr. Cray important on the mind without sharing. Okay, very good. Well then, Dr. Woods, I turn things back over to you, and thank you for the opportunity. I like Dr. Cray's or Mr. Cray's conception of humble. I'm not sure I did a very good job, but I tried to moderate what is a stellar group of readers. So thank you for the honor.
Well, I thank you for leading and moderating and being a great example for what the kinds of conversations that we try to do in this program. And if anybody watching has any questions, you can look at our YouTube account and contact us through studyliberalarts.org. And other students in the program, we want to encourage you to participate in other colloquiums coming up in the future. But I thank you all very much, and with that, we'll just let everybody go.